Great deal of anticipation. People expecting jaw-dropping stuff, bombshells, some said. Did you get any of that?
Well, certainly there are some elements of Vytjie Mentor's testimony that are fundamental to the work that the inquiry is doing. There was a smaller audience today than on Friday, but perhaps this isn't really about a popularity contest. This is about determining the facts, which Zondo must take into account when he makes his final report. And some of the details of that flight to China via Dubai, which she's spoken about there, are important to this narrative she's building in her testimony, saying that Duduzane Zuma was on that flight. She met Fana Hlongwane, although in her book she referred to him as Brian Hlongwa, and there was some questioning in order to determine if she knew who she was talking about and was certain that it was in fact Fana Hlongwane, and then meeting one of the Gupta brothers. And there was quite a sort of amount of detail on how she managed to get to the point where she could distinguish between the Gupta brothers, saying, for example, that she used a gold ring with a ruby in it on an index finger to identify one of the brothers, Ajay, I think it was. Then also saying that she used their build or their level of obesity, I think was the in fact term that she used, to try and determine who they were, and also height in order to distinguish between the three different brothers.
But just, speaking as a journalist who were, covering the Commission's work and whoever else may have been there, how much of that inability to distinguish between Hlongwa and Hlongwane and between the Gupta brothers could, affect, potentially, her credibility as a witness?
Well, certainly that will be up to the inquiry, the legal team that is assessing the evidence and leading evidence in these hearings. But also it will be probably grounds for critiquing Vytjie Mentor's arguments and her testimony if we get to a point where cross-examination is allowed. That's something we're still expecting a ruling on, although there has been some movement since Friday. So Advocate Vincent Maleka telling Zondo, for example, we have various applications here, including one from a Major General in the Hawks who was implicated in killing an investigation by Mcebisi Jonas's testimony, and a member of the presidency who Vytjie Mentor said phoned her to try and set up this meeting with President Jacob Zuma in Johannesburg, which was the cue for her to come to Johannesburg and then end up at the Sahara Computers office, and following that in Saxonwold. So certainly a lot of movement, and we're expecting to have that on the table first thing tomorrow morning when the inquiry resumes its hearing.
Well, an interesting proposition was thrown around there, that the legal team saying if the implicated people want to cross-examine her, for example, or anybody, for that matter, they must then be willing to not only provide their version, of events, but agree also to the fact that they too will be cross-examined, which I think is going to be an interesting one.
Yes, so Advocate Maleka there sort of speaking, it seems, on behalf of the legal team in the inquiry, urging Zondo to consider this, to say that if you want to give heat in cross-examining witnesses who've implicated you in this inquiry, well, you've got to take the heat as well and sit in the witness box and give your version and be cross-examined. But Zondo is sort of pausing there and saying, well, what do the rules say? And then he and Maleka discussed rule number 3, which is in the Government Gazette, and I've had a look at it as well, and the rule stipulates that that person who's been implicated must give their version. And now the question is, what form will that version take? Will it take the version of a written submission, or will it take the version of oral testimony before the inquiry, in which case, that just adds a whole nother chapter of discussions, cross-examinations, bombshells, fireworks, who knows?
But face value, it does look like quite an incredible thing to argue. What's good for the goose must be good for the gander. But let's go to her testimony. She's at the Gupta compound, has ordered her mutton curry and tea. And has seen the quite beautiful
golden
restrooms and those French mirrors and everything that goes with that. But a revelation she made that she was then offered the Ministry of Public Enterprises. That's if she scrapped that South African Airways route to India.
Quite right. So this is her describing a moment of conversation with a Gupta brother at that Saxonwold compound, and what the conditions were on his version, how he set things up for this quid pro quo around her doing something for them and getting something in return. Let's take a look.
He said I could be minister I said, how so? He said the president was going to reshuffle his cabinet in the recent future, and Minister Barbara Hogan was going to be reshuffled, and I could become the minister in her place when she's reshuffled if I agree that once I become the minister, I would abolish the SAA India, South Africa, India, South Africa route.
Now, at that time she's referring to, Barbara Hogan was the Minister of Public Enterprises, correct?
Quite right.
She gets kicked out. Malusi Gigaba gets brought in, and as soon as he's in, what happens?
Lo and behold, the route's cancelled. And that's something Vytjie Mentor added toward the end of today, that she wanted to highlight a chronology of events and have that included in her witness testimony, because Zondo had asked at the beginning of the day, are there any amendments you'd like to name, anything you'd like to retract or add to your witness testimony? At that point, she said, I'm so anxious, I can't answer. I don't know what I want to change or omit. And by the end of today, I think she'd relaxed somewhat and then mentioned that chronology, including the cancellation of that route after Gigaba's arrival. I have to say, then there was kind of a quick sort of pause from Maleka and from Zondo and said, sort of hold your horses in a way. We'll come back to that. And she is set to testify again at the beginning of next year on SOEs and the like. So perhaps they will revisit that issue down the line.
But just from today's testimony, any other thing that you picked up on which you think is, something that's going to, the Commission may sort of focus a great deal on come the next, either her next appearance or other people, or the testimonies of other people who will follow her?
Well, two things I'd like to say on that front. The first is the issue of nuclear. Nuclear has become a nuclear word in the inquiry hearings, in the testimony of Jonas and also in Vytjie Mentor's testimony, because in addition to talking about that SAA route between Johannesburg and Mumbai, she spoke about nuclear and the Gupta brothers saying to her, we know about nuclear, we know that there's uranium in the Northern Cape, which is an old stomping ground of yours. I'm paraphrasing here, but this is the gist of it. And we are keen to become the main nuclear supplier for this new nuclear deal. This pebble bed project, and I still need to figure out what on earth a pebble bed is. I must confess my ignorance on that one. But this pebble bed project you've been working on is toast. It's been wasteful, and we're going to shut it down, or it's going to be shut down. And we are keen to be a uranium supplier, and maybe you can help us out with that. Maybe you can be useful to us on that front. And so this nuclear project and this issue of uranium has come out as being a very important part of her testimony. And that obviously dovetails with some of what Mcebisi Jonas was talking about on Friday. The other point I want to make is that while there were some scoffs and sort of giggles, and I too found myself at points being like, my goodness, she's going into way too much detail about the interior decor of the Saxonwold compound. Do we really need to know whether or not, Vytjie Mentor thinks that their taste in French art is valid or not? I don't think that that's a fair assessment. I think what she did in all of that kind of peripheral detail was actually give us some insight into how the Guptas lived, how she experienced being in that house, her encounter with the man she believes and understands was the private chef of the family, coming in barefoot in a white shirt and bowing to her and saying, yes, and sort of kowtowing to her, and that it made her feel entirely uncomfortable with the whole situation. She said, I don't want to be disrespectful to other people's cultures, but I don't feel that someone bowing to me is appropriate. And so I think what she's given to us with all of those details, which actually are quite gripping images, gives us an idea of a house that none of us are likely to ever see. A golden bathroom, these sort of majestic mirrors that she saw, columns, giant paintings on the walls. She's given us a real window into the life that they lived privately and contrasted that with the drab, shabby tables in their Sahara Computers office. So one kind of aesthetic in their business settings, another aesthetic in their home. And I think that was an interesting and valuable contribution to the discussion around the Guptas.
I think you're correct. The insights into what could potentially lure or at the very least impress, people and regard those people as being legit and as rich and as they claim to be. So what's happening tomorrow, quickly?
So Vytjie Mentor continues her testimony tomorrow, Advocate Sello today, and I must say at points being quite rigorous with Vytjie Mentor on some of the details. Why didn't you ask where you were when you pitched up at the gate to this unknown Saxonwold property, for example? So Advocate Sello resumes cross-examination of Vytjie Mentor tomorrow. That is after we have some discussion on these applications for cross-examination, and then we're going to have to see how far it goes. It seems as though Sello believes she'll be done by midday.
Okay, Erin Bates, that's where we're going to leave it for now. She was, of course,